The Artemis program is coming together. We have our rocket, we have our capsule, and now NASA has chosen their lander, Starship. If you're interested in finding out why NASA chose Starship, check out my last video. It's also a perfect segue into this video since I left you all with a cliffhanger. So let's get started. Today, we're going to discuss NASA's current plan for using Starship for the Artemis program and the positives and negatives of that plan. Next, I'll run down some other ways they could use Starship and how these would compare with the current plan. Then, a quick discussion of how these changes would affect other parts of the Artemis program before I close out the video with my final thoughts. So, how does NASA plan to use the lunar Starship right now? Some parts of this plan are still a bit unclear, but here goes. The lunar Starship is launched into Earth orbit with its payload for the moon. Next, it is refueled, however much it is needed for the mission. This largely depends on where you want your empty Starship to end up and how much payload you want to take. These are the key decision points that I'll be manipulating in this video to explore some unique use cases for this vehicle. Starship then flies out to the moon and enters lunar orbit. Once the Starship is in position, NASA will launch the 4 astronauts from Earth out to lunar orbit using the HLS rocket and Orion capsule. The Orion capsule will then dock with the Starship and the crew will transfer over. Starship then takes the crew and its payload down to the surface of the moon where the payload is unloaded and the crew completes their mission on the moon. When they are done, they all hop back in the lunar Starship and lift off back to lunar orbit where they transfer into Orion. Orion then takes them all the way back to the surface of Earth. Now, as far as NASA is concerned, the Starship's mission is completed in lunar orbit as soon as it transfers the crew back to Orion. Here's where a lot of uncertainty lies with the architecture right now. We're not sure at this point if Starship returns itself to Earth orbit or if it waits in lunar orbit for a refuel. Now, in NASA's source selection statement, they praise Starship for performing all of its refueling maneuvers in Earth's orbit. NASA also points out multiple times how SpaceX's architecture is fully reusable and specifically states how their design is sustainable from the beginning and does not need to evolve to a sustainable operation state in the future like the other bids. By recognizing the reusability of Starship and stating that it only refuels in Earth orbit, this would seem to imply that after the mission, Starship returns to Earth orbit to prepare for the next one. The only problem is that given what we currently know about Starship, it isn't really capable of doing this. That is, if you only use one lunar Starship, only refuel it in low Earth orbit, and refuel it without any people on board during the refuelings. If any of these constraints are wavered, it can be done, but we'll get onto that later. For now, let's just go on with the discussion, keeping in mind that we aren't sure whether Starship stays behind in lunar orbit or comes back to Earth. Just know that if it does come back to Earth for each mission, its payload is likely just a few tons. If it stays around the moon, that means a lot more refuelings, but it can also bring a lot more stuff each time. Let's cover the positives of this architecture. First off, it completes or exceeds all current mission objectives for Artemis. It can bring all 4 astronauts and more than 850 kilograms of payload down to the surface. If you want to take a modest payload, you only need a few refuelings, which is good for cost, cadence, and is especially good in a scenario where flying Starship isn't as routine as we expect it to be. As far as any major standout positives besides these, there really aren't any. All of these architectures are going to be really cool because they bring stuff and people to the moon, but we're looking for the unique positives and negatives here. So for the negatives, one huge one is that with this method you can only bring 4 astronauts to the surface of the moon each year due to the launch cadence of SLS. I think this isn't great for some obvious reasons, but I really go into detail in my video Improving Artemis. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, feel free to check it out. On the Starship side of things, there are a few issues depending on where it ends up. If it stays around the moon waiting for the next mission, then things really start to not make sense. For the next mission, you would need to bring fuel and payload out to it in lunar orbit. That would mean you're bringing another lunar-rated Starship all the way out to the moon's orbit, with payload and fuel on board. Why not just use that one to land the next batch of people and cargo on the moon and avoid all the time, effort, and risk associated with transferring the cargo and fuel from one vehicle to another for no reason? And either way here, you're left with one empty Starship sitting around the moon. Now, if it's coming back to Earth, it makes a bit more sense, but you still have the issue of transferring the cargo over from one Starship to the other. This would limit the size of the payload NASA could fit inside a Starship, since all of the cargo would need to be transferred through the IDA docking port, which is only 31 inches wide. Not ideal. Besides that, imagine having to move 100 tons of stuff from one vehicle to the other. Also, who exactly would be moving this stuff? It would require a whole additional crew to be flown up to low Earth orbit just to transfer cargo over. And transferring this cargo over from one Starship's cargo bay to another via some robotic arm like Canadarm is a whole different can of worms and would be just as hard, if not more difficult. So that's a quick rundown of the positives and negatives for the current plan for using the HLS Starship. And obviously, there are some real concerns here. You may ask yourself, why would they use it this way? Well, you see, the HLS was only ever meant to be some little lander that could take a few astronauts down from Orion to the moon. That's why NASA's promotional videos for Artemis all look like this. And that's also the reason the Dynetics and Blue Origin's proposals look the way they do. Starship is, shall we say, a wildly capable vehicle. SpaceX was building it anyway for their own purposes, and basically said, hey, Starship can do what NASA wants the HLS to do, so let's bid it. So these considerations of how do we reuse 100% of the craft right away, and gee, it's hard to transfer 100 tons of cargo from one lander to another, simply weren't even considerations for Artemis until now. Now, NASA has chosen a very different style of lander than what they imagined they would ever be using just a few years ago. And it would be wise to use this different style of lander in a different way. Okay, so when considering better ways to use Lunar Starship, I began by looking at what we need on the surface of the moon for a lunar base. After a lot of thinking, it finally hit me that everything falls into just one of two categories. Things we want to come back to Earth, and things we want to leave on the moon. So what do we want to stay on the moon? Well, the structures that make up the base obviously have to stay. Everything we would call cargo also needs to stay. That's all the supplies that would maintain the base and its occupants. That's lunar terrain vehicles. That's science experiments and equipment, power generation units, and stuff of that nature. Truthfully, the only thing that needs to come back to Earth is the people. Of course, they may want to take some rocks or small pieces of science experiments back, but not much else. The whole point of setting up a base on the moon is to bring stuff to the moon after all. So it's not surprising that the majority of stuff falls in the one-way category. So now that we have everything organized into round trip and one way, an important difference becomes apparent. The things that need to stay at the moon are all large, heavy, or in very high quantities. But the stuff that needs to make the longer round trip is very lightweight in comparison. So now, let's take a look at the Starship lander itself. As I stated earlier, Starship's capabilities hinge around how much mass you want to take and how far you want to take it. To put it simply, it can take a whole lot of stuff a short distance, or take a small amount of stuff a long way. And this is perfectly aligned with the two categories. We need to bring a lot of heavy stuff to the moon and leave it there, and we need to take a few lightweight humans a long way all the way to the moon and all the way back. Let's take a deeper look into what splitting Starship missions into one-way cargo deliveries and round-trip astronaut deliveries would look like, starting with the one-way cargo trip. By flying cargo on a one-way HLS Starship, we unlock some key benefits. First, cargo is now exclusively loaded onto Starship in the easiest place and easiest way imaginable, right here on Earth. There's no need for any difficult and potentially risky cargo transfers from one Starship to another in orbit around the Earth or Moon. Second, we are optimizing our vehicle to bring the most amount of useful payload per mission. By ending the journey at the Moon, we are cutting the delta V required for this mission in half essentially. An HLS Starship with a 90-ton dry mass can deliver, wait for it, 210 tons of usable payload to the moon when used this way. Yeah. Now, this may seem crazy, but Starship can actually do this. Think of it this way. Every time you've heard someone say Starship can bring 100 tons down to the surface, it was actually bringing much, much more than that, because it was also carrying a huge amount of fuel in order to lift back off from the moon and bring its gigantic self to lunar orbit or beyond. Now, what used to be several tons of takeoff fuel can be replaced with usable cargo for Artemis. We are essentially doubling the usefulness of each Starship mission. Now I know what you're thinking, Starship is a fully reusable vehicle, and by using it in an expendable way, it can't be used again. But stay with me, this is actually the third and biggest benefit of this method. Now remember, if we wanted to reuse this lunar Starship for landing cargo, we not only are greatly limiting its capability, but we run into all the awkward flaws that I highlighted earlier in this video, about the difficulty of transferring large amounts of cargo in space, and so on. But here's the real benefit. We aren't actually expending this Starship. We are going to use it again, just not as a lander. Think of what Starship is. It's a 100-ton, 50-meter tall steel building with more habitable volume than the International Space Station, on-board redundant life support systems, radiation protection, 2 airlocks with crew access to the surface, and its own power generating solar panels. If that isn't a lunar base, I don't know what is. So we can continue to get use out of the lunar Starship in a myriad of ways as a base, and these bases could be specialized as desired. A base for the crew to stay in during their lunar mission, a food hub dedicated to aquaponics and greenhouses, a lunar garage for housing terrain vehicles or science experiments when they're not in use, a solar storm shelter, or any mix of these items. Now, a quick aside about these bases. I know some people who hear this and think, great, yet another part of Artemis being done by SpaceX. To those people, I say 3 things. First, I'm not saying that this should be the only type of base module used for Artemis. Second, Starship is a 100-ton vehicle with all these features. Do you really want us to take it all the way down to the surface of the moon and then not use it? And finally, just look at the merits of this base. Take away the names SpaceX and Starship and Elon Musk. Let's just think of these positives. A space company has a base bigger than the International Space Station that can be brought to the moon in one go. Now, by definition, it's pretty much the biggest base we could have for Artemis because it doesn't have to fit inside our biggest Artemis lander. Not only that, this base does not need to be unloaded off of a lander down to the surface of the moon with some special crane system. This base can move itself around to new positions on the moon when desired, and here's the really crazy part. Its development is already funded and underway. That last part is really important considering Congress is already constricting NASA's desired budget for Artemis for items like the human landing system. To be blunt, if you're against this incredibly useful capability, all because a SpaceX logo happens to be attached to it, you are not Team Space and you do not want what's best for Artemis. Now for the round-trip human transport. First, let me recap the advantages of taking crew from Earth orbit to the surface of the moon and back to Earth orbit on the HLS Starship as opposed to flying crew out to the moon on Orion and having the Starship only ferry crew from lunar orbit to the surface and back to Orion. I went into excruciating detail about the benefits this would have for Artemis in my video, Improving Artemis. So if you're really interested in it, go and check that video out. Basically, SLS can only fly once per year. And this is great on one hand because it means we can take 4 people to the moon. But on the other hand, this means we can only take 4 people to the moon. Even if SLS cadence increases to twice per year in the future, the most we could hope for is 8 astronauts to the moon every year. I don't know about you, but I'm not so sure this qualifies as a sustainable presence. Also, it's no secret that SLS Orion is expensive. The marginal cost per Artemis mission for the SLS rocket and Orion capsule alone is $2.4 billion. How I arrived at this number is in that aforementioned video. That's about 10% of NASA's annual budget, so this would mean that the crew launch to the moon is taking up a very large slice of our potential Artemis funds. And lastly, only SLS and Orion are capable of flying crews all the way out to the moon. So this not only locks out any other commercial or partner nation providers who could otherwise contribute to bringing crews to the moon, it also means we don't have a backup. If we allow the HLS Starship to ferry the crew from Earth orbit and back, we get a laundry list of benefits. Here they are, rapid fire. This allows much cheaper and higher launch cadence vehicles to bring crew to the moon, such as Atlas V Starliner and Falcon 9 Crew Dragon. A Crew Dragon mission costs $220 million and a Starliner $360 million in total, about 10 times cheaper than just the marginal cost of SLS and Orion. This allows NASA to leverage its previous investment in commercial crew for new uses. This provides triple redundancy, meaning we'd have Orion, Dragon, and Starliner all capable of bringing humans to the moon. And this would mean all crew transfers take place around the Earth, which is safer than around the moon. This method allows any company or nation that is capable of getting stuff into low Earth orbit to bring that stuff to the moon without them having to develop a gigantic mega rocket. This also gives the astronauts more space on their multi-day journey to the moon. This would even allow for more than 4 astronauts at a time to make a trip. Simply launch a Starliner to the HLS Starship with 4 astronauts and then a Dragon with another 4 astronauts. This would mean you could bring 8 astronauts at a time out to the moon for less than a quarter of the marginal launch cost of SLS and Orion. I could go on, but in short, this just allows NASA to bring more people to the moon for less money, increasing our productivity at the moon and freeing up funds for other Artemis projects. I'm going to cover what this may mean for SLS later in the video. But right here, I just want to note that this doesn't mean that SLS has to be canceled or replaced entirely, especially not right away. The first few missions could still be on SLS, and SLS could even work alongside this, taking 4 additional astronauts to the moon in the traditional way each year. It just wouldn't be the only astronauts going to the moon that year, which is awesome, and we'll come back to this though. Let's talk about the logistics of this mission. The HLS Starship can go from Earth orbit to the moon surface and back to Earth orbit. There's no question about that. The only question is how exactly you want to accomplish it. I don't want to bore you all with the maths of these various trips, but here's a few options with their positives and negatives. First, we have to give credence to the possibility that we are indeed reading the NASA source selection statement right. I can't figure a way for this architecture to work, but NASA and SpaceX know more about the HLS Starship than anyone, and they seem to indicate that the HLS Starship goes from low Earth orbit to the moon's surface and back to low Earth orbit every mission. We'll have to wait and find out more to see if this is possible. But if this is the case, then things are trivially easy. Just board the Starship in LEO and ride it back. There are basically no negatives if this type of mission is possible, and it only uses one Starship and 11 refuelings. Now, if this isn't possible, then there are other ways I can think of to get crews from low Earth orbit and back using the HLS Starship. First up, we have the option I covered in my Improving Artemis video. You fully fuel up the Starship in low Earth orbit, and it can take the crew from that orbit all the way to the moon, to the surface, and all the way back to Earth orbit, but only a highly elliptical Earth orbit since it can't make it all the way back to LEO. You would have pre-staged a tanker in that elliptical orbit to transfer enough fuel over to the lunar Starship to allow it to get back to the crew capsule in LEO. The advantages of this option are it only uses one HLS Starship and it operates right out of low Earth orbit, so any rocket capable of getting crew capsules to LEO can access it without any modification. Dragon, Starliner, and any future LEO vehicles can all participate. The negatives are that this takes 14 Starship launches in total instead of 12, which isn't really a big difference. The biggest negative here is that this method features a refueling event while crew are on board the Starship, something NASA was glad SpaceX avoided in their original bid. This is a concern because any mission event has a degree of risk associated with it, but I would like to point out it's not like the crew would be on board during the first ever Starship refueling. By this point in the program, Starship would have refueled dozens of times for Artemis alone, not to mention all other potential Starship missions. At a certain point, you would think this procedure could be deemed safe enough for crew, but still, it's certainly a negative. The last method that I can think of is capable of getting the crew to and from low Earth orbit without any refuelings while crew is on board, and provides additional redundancy to the mission. This method uses 2 HLS Starships instead of 1. The first Starship is fully refueled in low Earth orbit, and the second Starship is only refueled 6 times. The crew launches on their LEO capsule and gets on board the fully fueled Starship. Both Starships then depart for the moon together. This gives the mission added redundancy so that if any point something goes wrong with one of the Starships, there's another one they can rely on. When the 2 Starships arrive at the moon, they both enter lunar orbit. The one with the crew on board goes down to the moon's surface, and the mission is carried out while the other one waits in lunar orbit. After the mission, the crew launches back up to lunar orbit and transfers over to the other Starship that stayed behind. Since this Starship skipped the lunar landing, it has enough fuel to take the crew all the way back to their capsule in low Earth orbit. The Starship that landed can make it back to an elliptical Earth orbit and get refueled to return to LEO to prepare for the next mission. Note that this refueling no longer takes place with the crew on board since they took the other Starship home. The advantages of this method are numerous. No refueling while the crew is on board, and tons of added redundancy throughout the mission. The only disadvantage is that instead of 1, 2 HLS Starships are required. But this is the value of fully reusable vehicles. It doesn't honestly matter because these 2 vehicles can be used as many times as you like. This does require more Starship launches, 21 in total, but only 19 are required to get crew to and from the moon. The 2 other ones are to return the HLS to LEO for the next mission. Now, this is quite a few more launches than 12, but the additional crew safety could justify the cost increase. Not to mention, Starship launches won't cost that much. As I've discussed before, they will certainly be less than $28 million each, so these 21 launches would cost between $168 and $588 million. Even the extremely high-end estimate gives a total mission cost of $808 million from the Earth's surface to the Moon's surface and back, still more than 3 times cheaper than the $2.7 billion total cost of an SLS Orion and HLS Starship surface mission. Okay, so now that we have covered how I would prefer NASA to use the lunar Starship, let's now compare the results of these different methods for the Artemis program. First, let's compare bringing astronauts to the moon. We're going to look at the results over a span of time from a theoretical first landing in 2026 out to the year 2040, which would mean SLS could do 15 missions. Each one of these missions of an SLS launching 4 astronauts on Orion out to an HLS Starship lander would have a marginal cost of over $2.65 billion, making the cost per astronaut to the surface $662 million. Note that for all these options, I'm using a Starship launch cost of $18 million to keep it simple. Now, assuming each flight takes all 4 astronauts to the surface to make it simple, this would mean 60 astronauts would go to the surface by 2040. If each mission lasted an average of 3 weeks in length, then that would mean humans would have been on the surface for a total of 315 days from 2026 to 2040, meaning a human presence of 5.75%. Finally, we have the human time spent on the moon. This is the combined time spent by each individual astronaut, and it's a great way to think of productivity. The more astronauts, the more you can get accomplished. For the SLS Orion method, the total human time would be 3.68 years. Now let's see how the Falcon 9 to HLS Starship compares. Now, Starliner could also do this mission for around $140 million more. This is the method that doesn't actually work out with our current knowledge of Starship, so just keep that in mind. The marginal cost of this mission would be $436 million, giving us a per astronaut cost of $109 million. If we spent the same amount as it would cost to fly an SLS Orion, this could perform 6 missions each year, giving us a total of 90 missions to the surface. These 90 missions would bring 360 astronauts to the moon and would represent 1,890 days of lunar missions. That would mean humanity spent 34.5% of the 15-year period on the moon. The total time of all astronauts on the surface would add up to almost 21 years. Finally, we'll compare the dual HLS Starship method. I chose to compare only these 2 Starship methods because personally I prefer them and they represent the least and most expensive options, meaning any of the other methods using Starship to transfer crew from low Earth orbit would have results falling somewhere in between these 2. The per mission cost is $598 million, meaning we could have about 4.5 missions per year for the cost of 1 SLS Orion flight. That would give us a total of 66 missions, taking 264 astronauts to the moon to explore. The cost per astronaut would be $150 million. These missions would last about 1,386 days, meaning humans would be present on the moon for over 25% of the 15-year time span. The total combined time of every human on the moon would span over 15 years. Now, the results here I think speak for themselves, but we'll summarize these again after we take a look at the cargo comparison. For cargo, I'll be comparing 2 variations on the current method, which I'm calling return to low Earth orbit, because the HLS Starships are being returned to Earth orbit to be reused as landers on future missions. One will be taking 25 tons of cargo down to the surface, and the other will be taking 100 tons. Then we'll see how these 2 stack up against the idea of using Starship as a one-way lander that stays on the moon to become a base. The 25-ton return to low Earth orbit architecture takes, 25 tons to the moon. At a cost of $18 million per launch, the mission would cost a total of $252 million, bringing the price per kilogram to $10,000. This mission would require 14 total Starship launches. The initial launch of the HLS plus 11 refuelings in low Earth orbit would get it out to the moon and all the way back to geostationary orbit. Then you would need to launch a tanker and another refuel to go give it the fuel it needs to get back to Leo. So, the positives of this method is you get to keep using the HLS as a lander for as long as you want. But you have to do the difficult in-space transfer of 25 tons of cargo each time, and you're limiting the size of base modules you can take to the surface. The 100-ton option is much more difficult. It would take 25 Starship launches to complete, bringing the total cost to $450 million. Since it can bring 100 tons to the surface, the cost per kilogram would be $4,500. Now, I know you're thinking 25 launches seems really high, but that's the best I could figure out, even pushing it. It basically requires the initial Starship launch, plus 12 refueling flights to get it out to the moon, and then an additional Starship launch that's fully refueled 11 times to go meet it out in lunar orbit to give it the fuel to make it back to low Earth orbit. That refueling Starship that went to the moon then has to aero capture back into Leo from lunar velocity, something that early Starships may not be capable of doing. Now, I'm a Starship optimist, but that is a lot of launches. Still, the dollar per kilogram to the moon is cheaper than most of today's rockets cost to get a kilogram to low Earth orbit. The positives are, again, you get to keep using it as a lander. But on the other hand, you still have to do that difficult in-space cargo transfer of 100 tons of stuff. Now, who or what is moving 100 tons of stuff between Starships? I have no clue. And of course, it limits the size of base modules it can bring and requires Starships to be able to survive that re-entry from lunar velocities. At a certain point, if you really want to do round-trip cargo flights reusing Starships, it just makes sense to wait for the normal Starship to be lunar capable, because even with the added mass of the heat shield, header tanks, and wings, it can take 25 tons down to the surface and make it all the way back to Earth and land from a full tank in Leo, avoiding 13 additional refuelings and all the problems of transferring cargo in space and so on. Now, finally, we have the one-way cargo method. With just 12 refuelings, this method can take up to 210 tons to the surface of the moon. The launch cost of this mission would be $234 million. This doesn't include the cost of the HLS Starship itself for a few reasons. For one, we don't know what that unit cost will be, but mainly it's because the HLS is going to stay behind as a gigantic lunar base. So in my mind, it is a payload in and of itself, and it wouldn't really make sense to include it in the launch cost. So this $216 million mission gives us a cost per kilogram of $1,100. The positives to this are you get a gigantic base on the surface of the moon, and you never have to transfer tons of cargoes in space. It's all loaded right here on Earth. However, the HLS cannot be reused over and over as a cargo lander, but could be used as a base on the surface. Alright, here's a quick summary of the comparison between the current plan and the method I proposed. We just went over all these numbers, so I won't bore you with them again, but sometimes it just helps to take a look side by side. In this image, the better results are highlighted in green. As you can see, the alternate method outperforms in literally every category, which is why I prefer it. So, my final thoughts for this video are just going to cover the obvious question, which is, where does this leave the Space Launch System? As I've said before, this doesn't mean SLS must be cancelled, especially not right away. It can still do the first 1 or 2 missions and can even fly 4 additional people to the moon each year alongside the Leo Starship method. But at a certain point, it just stops making sense if you have human-rated starships going to and from the moon for a fraction of the cost that NASA could just fly up to in LEO using Crew Dragon and Starliner. I just want to point out that it's not like one of these methods is any less NASA than the other. The SLS, HLS Starship, Crew Dragon and Starliner capsules, and even some of the Falcon 9 all had their development funded by NASA. This would just be moving crew launch over from the old way NASA did contracting, cost plus, to the new way NASA does contracting, firm fixed commercial. An unavoidable dilemma has been set up by NASA choosing the Starship for the HLS lander. For the start of the Artemis program, SLS and Starship are now intrinsically tied to one another, but in an uneven manner. Every time SLS launches, Starship will launch at least 10 times for the very same mission. That's not including any of the other Starship launches outside of the Artemis program. By SLS's third or fourth launch, Starship will likely have flown over 50 times. There's no way that this elephant in the room can be avoided forever.